It is, I think, one of the most staggering facts about our existence, a truth so immense and yet so familiar that it often slips beneath the surface of our attention. Consider, just for a moment, the sheer improbability of your own consciousness. You are a collection of atoms, forged in the hearts of dying stars billions of years ago, that has somehow come together to form a structure capable of contemplating itself. You are the universe knowing itself, and yet, for roughly 1/3 of our time on this fragile blue jewel of a planet, we willingly surrender that precious gift. We turn it off. We succumb to a state that, to an outside observer, looks indistinguishable from non-existence. We disconnect. As we prepare to look deeper into this, a gentle invitation to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Now, let's drift back into the narrative. Think about what that actually means. The rich, vibrant tapestry of sensory information that bombards us every waking moment. The symphony of sounds, the complex textures of the world against our skin, the fluctuations in temperature, the very visceral sense of inhabiting a body in a specific point in space and time. All of that fades. It retreats into a distant, indistinct murmur, and then, inevitably, into silence. Our consciousness, that flame which illuminates the darkness of the cosmos, simply dissolves. It vanishes. And the most terrifying part, if you truly let yourself dwell on it, is that we don't even notice its departure. We don't feel the moment the light goes out. We spend our days as beings defined by action and perception. The great Carl Linnaeus, the man who sought to bring order to the chaos of the natural world by classifying the kingdom of life, defined animals by these very traits, creatures that feel and creatures that move. These are the hallmarks of our waking lives. They are the fundamental properties that separate us from the unfeeling geology of the earth, from the granite and the basalt, and from the rooted, silent existence of the plant kingdom. And yet, with a regularity that is governed by the rotation of our planet, we let them go. We lie down, the muscles that have carried us through the gravity field of the Earth all day begin to relax. The chaotic whirlwind of the day's events begins to slow in the neural pathways of our minds, and we slip away. I wonder, have you ever tried to catch that moment? The precise instant where the eye ceases to be? You can't do it. It is an impossible task, a paradox. To observe the moment you fall asleep, you would have to be awake to observe it. One moment you're there, caught in the flow of thoughts, remembering the past, anticipating the future, and the next, you are simply not. The transition is seamless. It is unperceivable. It is a quiet miracle, a vanishing act we perform thousands upon thousands of times in a human lifetime. It is a miracle so common, as the neurobiologist Charles Sherrington once beautifully remarked, that it becomes ordinary. A wonder that, through the sheer relentlessness of repetition, becomes mundane. But it is anything but mundane. It is perhaps the most profound mystery in biology. The word sleep itself is a slippery thing, isn't it? It's a word we use constantly, but it masks a complexity that is almost infinite. It can mean so many different things depending on who you are speaking to. It is the desperate, visceral craving you feel in your bones after a long day of labour. It is the clinical, precise state a doctor discusses when you sit in a surgery complaining of insomnia. It is a biological process, a dance of ions and neurotransmitters that a scientist studies with charts and electrodes. It is the restorative sanctuary we retreat to when our bodies are broken by illness or weariness. When we are awake, immersed in the frenetic business of living, we rarely give it a second thought unless we're forced to. It's rather like breathing, isn't it? We don't notice the constant rhythmic exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide that sustains our cellular machinery, not until a doctor places a cold stethoscope on our chest and asks us to breathe in, breathe out. Life is impossible without breath, and as far as we can tell, for complex sentient creatures like us, life is also impossible without sleep. But here is the question that haunts me. Where do we go? Every morning the sun rises, the atmosphere scatters the light, and we open our eyes. The world rushes back in. We know, with an unshakable, intuitive certainty, that we have returned. We have woken up just as we did yesterday and the day before that, in an unbroken chain stretching back to our infancy. But do we ever stop to truly contemplate the fact that for several hours we were absent? Our bodies were there, certainly. They were inert, warm, metabolizing slowly in our beds. But our conscious self, the I that is listening to this voice, the entity that experiences the story of your life, where was it? It was somewhere else. Or perhaps it was nowhere at all. It is a sobering thought, that our existence is not continuous, but punctuated by these vast voids of nothingness. This question of consciousness, which for centuries was the exclusive playground of philosophers and theologians, has finally and rightly been embraced by the natural sciences. And as we peer deeper into the machinery of the brain, the consensus is growing that consciousness is, perhaps, the single most valuable thing we possess. You could even argue, quite passionately, that it is more fundamental than life itself. After all, what is the value of existence in a universe of billions of galaxies if you lack the capacity to be aware of it? Think of the operating theatre. An anaesthetist administers a sophisticated cocktail of chemicals, and within seconds that extraordinary gift of nature is extinguished. The patient doesn't sense the darkness. They simply skip a portion of time. This happens to us every single night. We are anaesthetized by our own biology, by a pharmacy within our own brains. For many of us, this daily descent is a gentle, even pleasant process. As we drift on the event horizon of sleep, we might experience fleeting dreamlike images or sensations, what are known in the scientific literature as hypnagogic hallucinations. It's a fascinating state, a borderland between reality and imagination. The ancient Greeks, in their attempt to make sense of the world through myth, personified this nightly journey. Hypnos, the god of sleep, and his son Morpheus, the weaver of dreams, would begin to spin their mysterious algorithms for the night ahead. But for others, the journey isn't so smooth. They find themselves tossed on the waves of a stormy neurological sea, sinking into unconsciousness only to be thrown back into wakefulness, struggling to find that blissful submersion into deep sleep. So, how does it all work? To even begin to answer that, we have to strip it back. We have to start with a seemingly simpler question, one that sounds almost childish. What is it that truly separates wakefulness from sleep? It sounds simple, doesn't it? But try to articulate it. We always know we were sleeping in the past tense. Now, we are not. How do we know we are awake? Well, because we are perceiving the universe. We are processing data. We are thinking. We are moving. We are communicating. This, we feel, is the core evidence. We are always certain of our own wakefulness. It's fundamental. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, as Descartes famously proposed. But can we be so sure? Can we at any given moment be absolutely certain that we are fully, completely awake? Let's dissect this just for a moment. During wakefulness, we are in constant motion. Even now, as you sit there listening, you are making countless tiny, unconscious adjustments. Your biological machinery is humming. Your fingers might shift. You might adjust your position to relieve pressure. Your head might tilt. Can you say, without thinking, how many times you've moved your fingers in the last minute? Or how many tiny, rapid eye movements, saccades they're called, your eyes have made to scan your surroundings? We do this even with our eyes closed. Did you even notice you were doing it? But then, is movement truly the definition of being awake? Think of street performers, those incredible living statues who earn their living through absolute stillness. They are utterly immobile, freezing their physiology, yet they are most certainly awake. They are observing. So movement alone isn't the answer. And what about the other side of the coin? Did you know that the average person changes their body position dozens of times during the night, all without waking? The brain sends signals to the muscles, the body shifts, and consciousness never returns. Children can even fall out of bed and continue sleeping soundly on the floor, especially if there's a soft rug. And then there are the parasomnias, these strange hybrid states that occupy the misty valleys between the peaks of sleep and wakefulness. The most famous is somnambulism, sleepwalking. We have all heard stories of people performing complex tasks, navigating their homes, even cooking or driving, all while technically asleep. So, it is clearly not true that sleep and movement are mutually exclusive. Of course, it is true that our capacity for movement is significantly reduced during sleep. and for a very good evolutionary reason. We are vulnerable when we sleep. Our senses are dampened. We can't respond effectively to the snap of a twig or the scent of a predator. Staying still is a sensible strategy. It means you're less likely to attract unwanted attention in the dangerous theatre of the wild. This is especially true during that peculiar, fascinating phase of sleep known as REM, or paradoxical sleep. In this state, the brain is buzzing with electrical activity, sometimes even more so than when we're awake, consuming glucose at a prodigious rate. And yet the body's voluntary muscle systems are almost completely paralyzed. It is a safety mechanism preventing us from acting out the vivid simulations running in our minds. Have you ever had that terrifying experience of waking up from an intense dream and finding you can't move a muscle? It's called sleep paralysis. It might last for a fleeting moment or several long panicked seconds before your muscles are released and you can finally take a deep breath. It's a stark reminder that the control we feel we have over our bodies is, at times, just an illusion. So, if we can be still while awake and move while asleep, what is the real defining line? Perhaps the boundary isn't a line at all. Nature, we find, rarely deals in absolutes. Maybe it's more of a gradient, a spectrum. The animal kingdom, that vast laboratory of evolution, offers some truly extraordinary examples that blur this line completely. Consider the dolphin. These magnificent creatures, returning to the oceans from the land millions of years ago, face a constant dilemma. They must keep moving to breathe and stay warm, but they must also sleep. Their solution is a stroke of evolutionary genius. They sleep with one half of their brain at a time. One cerebral hemisphere will enter a state of deep, slow-wave sleep, recovering and repairing, while the other remains alert, keeping one eye open, controlling movement and watching for predators. Then, after a period, they switch. So, in a very real sense, dolphins are simultaneously awake and asleep. How do they manage this feat? Well, the bundle of nerve fibers connecting the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum, is relatively small in dolphins, which might facilitate this separation. But the precise mechanism that allows sleep to be contained in one half of the brain before seamlessly transferring to the other remains a profound mystery. It challenges our very notion of a unified self. Could something similar happen in us? Our own brains are asymmetrical, with the left and right hemispheres specializing in different tasks. While we probably can't achieve a fully split consciousness like a dolphin, there is fascinating evidence from patients whose corpus callosum has been severed, a radical treatment for severe epilepsy, that one hemisphere can be unaware of what the other is doing. And some studies suggest that even in healthy humans, sleep isn't always symmetrical. Certain phases might be deeper in one hemisphere than the other, particularly when we're in an unfamiliar environment, a sort of first night effect, where one half of the brain stays a little more vigilant, is sentinel in the night just in case. It's as if a primitive part of us remembers the dangers of the savannah, keeping watch while the rest stands down. This idea that sleep and wakefulness can coexist is most pronounced when we are sleep deprived. You know that feeling, don't you? When you're utterly exhausted, your eyes are heavy. The world seems to blur at the edges, but you are forcing yourself to stay awake. You might experience micro-sleeps, brief, seconds-long lapses into unconsciousness that you're not even aware of. The Italian neurophysiologist Giuseppe Maruzzi coined a wonderful term for these intermediate states, dormiveglia, or sleep wakefulness. For millennia, we have held this binary view: you're either asleep or you are awake, on or off. But it seems the reality is far more nuanced, far more blurry. We aren't a simple light switch. We are more like a complex landscape with regions of light and shadow, where parts of the brain can be in different states at the same time. This idea isn't entirely new. The Russian scientist Maria Manasena, one of the very first women to conduct serious research into sleep in the 19th century, wrote something remarkably prescient. She argued that those who considered sleep a complete shutdown of the brain were mistaken. During sleep, she wrote, the brain does not sleep at all. Only those parts of it that form the anatomical basis of consciousness are subject to falling asleep. Sleep is a time of rest for our consciousness. It's a beautiful thought. Maruzzi later refined this, suggesting that sleep doesn't affect the entire brain, or even the entire neocortex, but specifically those neurons and synapses that are involved in conscious behavior during wakefulness. But how on earth could you test such a thing experimentally? It is incredibly difficult. The brain was, until very recently, an impenetrable black box. We could see the inputs and the outputs, but the internal workings were hidden. New imaging technologies have granted us glimpses inside, but for most of scientific history, all we could observe was the body. And so, the traditional view of sleep as a state of total bodily rest, characterized by a lack of movement, held sway. Even the great Nobel laureate Ivan Pavlov, the father of classical conditioning, viewed sleep as a form of diffuse cortical inhibition, a wave of shutdown spreading across the brain's cortex like a fog. Today we know for a fact that this is not the case. The brain is a hive of activity when we sleep. It is burning energy, processing data, strengthening memories. It is just doing different things, and it seems logical to suppose that different parts of the brain might have different roles in the process of sleep, and even different needs for sleep. And this brings us to a fundamental problem, one that lies behind all these inexact definitions. One of the greatest obstacles to truly understanding sleep is the very language we use to describe it. Our words are clumsy, binary tools, awake, asleep, for a phenomenon that's probabilistic and analog. Imagine you have just drifted off and someone quietly enters the room, calls your name and gently pulls your blanket. You will probably wake up immediately. But if they try the same thing in the middle of the night, when you're in the deepest phase of sleep, the slow waves rolling through your cortex like the swell of an ocean, it will take much more effort to rouse you. This is what we call the arousal threshold, and it is not constant. It shifts throughout the night depending on the type of sleep you are in. It is also highly individual. Some people are light sleepers, stirred by the slightest sound, while others could sleep through a thunderstorm. This arousal threshold characterizes the depth of sleep. But despite how often we use that term, measuring it and interpreting it from a neurobiological perspective is far from simple. Herein lies the central paradox, a conundrum a bit like Schrödinger's famous thought experiment with the cat in the box. Erwin Schrödinger, one of the architects of quantum mechanics, devised this experiment in 1935 to illustrate the bizarre, counterintuitive nature of quantum superposition. You place a cat in a sealed box with a radioactive atom. If the atom decays, an event with a 50-50 probability, it triggers a mechanism that releases a poison, and the cat dies. If it doesn't decay, the cat lives. According to the mathematics of quantum mechanics, as long as the box is closed, the system is in a superposition of states. The cat is both alive and dead at the same time. Only when you open the box and make an observation does the wave function collapse, and the cat's fate resolve into one state or the other. Einstein loved this example. It beautifully highlighted the absurdity of trying to apply our everyday intuition to the quantum world. The very act of observing forces a reality. And so it is with sleep. To confirm that someone is truly asleep, you must interact with them, you must try to wake them. But the act of trying to get a response will, by its very nature, alter their state. It's like trying to measure the temperature of a tiny drop of water with a large thermometer. The thermometer itself changes the temperature you are trying to measure. So, for much of the night, our brain might exist in this superposition of states, a probabilistic blend of sleep and wakefulness. Sleep isn't a simple yes or no, it is a maybe. It is not a binary state, but a quantity. And that is what makes it so devilishly difficult to define. Here, let us pause and consider the implication of this. If sleep is not a single state, but a continuum, then consciousness itself might be a continuum. We tend to think of ourselves as either present or absent, but perhaps we are always fluctuating, a flickering candle in the wind of entropy. Our language, you know, is far too limited to describe such complex and relative concepts. But then, how many of us truly understand how our mobile phone works, or what every component in our car's engine does? Perhaps we don't need to. But with sleep, there is a pressing need to understand it better, simply to avoid the most glaring and dangerous misconceptions. Imagine going to your doctor and being asked, "What percentage of your brain was asleep last night?" Or, "How awake were you on the drive over here?" If those questions sound absurd to you, then perhaps you're beginning to sense the scale of the problem. Because understanding the answers, or at least appreciating their importance, could genuinely save your life, and not just your own. We live in a society that is chronically sleep-deprived, and the consequences are severe. So, what is this nightly journey really about? We spend decades of our lives exploring this other country, and yet we have no reliable maps. We know a great deal now, certainly more than we did a century ago, but no scientist can honestly claim that the mystery of sleep has been solved. We have accumulated a vast amount of data, yes. We can describe the phenomena, we can measure the electrical waves, but a deep fundamental understanding of what sleep is and why it is so essential, that still eludes us. And it is hard to say how many more generations of curious minds will be needed, how many more scientific paradigms will have to shift before we make significant progress. The journey begins not at dusk, when we lie down to sleep, but at dawn, with the strange and miraculous process of return. We go to sleep each night with an implicit faith that we'll come back the next morning, but we seldom pause to wonder how and why we wake up at all. How, in a state of altered, if not absent consciousness, do we manage to keep track of time, to sleep for our allotted 7 or 8 hours? Why do we sometimes struggle to wake without an alarm clock, that jarring emissary from the waking world? Is the duration of our sleep always the same, regardless of when we fall asleep? Many scientists believe that sleep is the price we pay for the activity of the previous day. It is a thermodynamic debt. The brain is an incredibly energy-intensive organ. It accounts for only about 2% of your body weight, yet it consumes 20% of your energy. That energy use creates waste products, heat, entropy. Sleep is the debt that accumulates during wakefulness. So how do we optimally divide our 24-hour allowance between these two states? Can we minimize the time spent sleeping, thereby extending the time we have to live and interact with the world? You might be surprised to learn that the process that tallies the minutes and hours allotted to each of us is mathematically precise, and that our sleep debt cannot accumulate indefinitely. A reckoning will always come. Nature always balances the books. But what is the currency of this transaction? That is one of the most important questions in the science of sleep. And when you look at certain creatures like the magnificent frigate birds that can soar over the oceans for hours without a single wing beat, flying for days on end without landing, you have to wonder, do they sleep in flight? And if so, how? Could we learn from them how to stay awake for longer? There was a time when science viewed sleep and wakefulness as mutually exclusive, all-or-nothing processes affecting the entire organism. We now know this is a gross oversimplification. At any given moment, it may be that only a fraction of our brain is actively awake, while the majority is, in effect, offline. What determines this? The regions of the brain responsible for generating and maintaining sleep and wakefulness are engaged in a fantastically complex dynamic dance. We know now that damage to certain parts of the hypothalamus, a tiny but crucial region deep in the brain, ancient in evolutionary terms, can cause profound insomnia, or even plunge a patient into a coma. But where is the master switch, the conductor of this incredible orchestra of neural processes and synaptic connections that decides when we sleep and when we wake? Is there even a single center for sleep at all? There are, of course, many factors that shape our sleep-wake cycle. We cannot talk about this without discussing the role of circadian rhythms, those internal biological clocks that tick away inside every single cell of our bodies. Why is it that some of us are larks, waking before dawn, while others are owls, just getting into their stride as the world goes to sleep? We need to consider the external cues, the Zeitgebers, or time givers, that synchronize the molecular orchestra within our cells to the rhythm of the planet. The rotation of the Earth creates a rhythm of light and dark, temperature and humidity, and life has evolved to dance to this beat. And the choice of when to sleep isn't just a human peculiarity. Some animals are diurnal, active during the day, some are nocturnal, masters of the dark, and some are crepuscular, active at the boundaries, at dawn and dusk. Why do elephants, some of the most intelligent and socially complex animals on Earth, get by on just a few hours of sleep a night, while bats spend the vast majority of their lives in slumber. We're accustomed to thinking of wakefulness as our primary state, the default setting from which we must reluctantly depart in order to sleep. But what if we've got it backwards? What if our baseline state, the fundamental condition of life, is actually sleep? It sounds like a radical idea, doesn't it? But some scientists propose that we wake up merely out of necessity, to handle the urgent business of life that we cannot attend to while asleep, like finding food and reproducing, before returning to our default state. This perspective completely upends our most fundamental assumptions about the role of sleep in our lives. It suggests that consciousness is the exception, not the rule. And how does this role change over a lifetime? In the first few months after birth, a human infant, like many other animals, spends most of its time asleep. What is the biological sense in that? It suggests that sleep plays a critical role in the construction of the brain itself. What happens to sleep as we grow, mature, and eventually age? Does sleep serve the same purpose just after birth as it does shortly before death? We have to take a journey through our own individual development, ontogeny, to understand why our sleep patterns change so dramatically with age, and how a lifetime of healthy sleep might influence the changes that come with senescence. Again and again, we will circle back to these fundamental questions. What is sleep? What happens during the process of falling asleep? And what unfolds as the night progresses? How have new technologies and discoveries in related fields shaped our understanding of sleep, wakefulness, and consciousness itself? Do we truly lose consciousness when we fall asleep? What determines the depth of our sleep? Why is it composed of such different phases, and how can we distinguish the slow, deep slumber from the paradoxical sleep characterized by rapid eye movements? And did you know that for some people suffering from severe depression, depriving them of sleep is considered one of the most promising therapeutic approaches? It seems counterintuitive, yet it hints at the deep chemical links between mood and sleep. Finally, we must ask about the emergence and evolution of sleep in the context of our planet's complex and dynamic ecosystems. We need to consider the role of sleep on a global scale. At any given moment, about 1 billion people on this planet are asleep. Roughly half of them are dreaming. Perhaps a third of them are snoring, disturbing the sleep of their partners. Many will soon open their eyes in the dark and be unable to fall back asleep, tossing and turning until morning. Some will reach for a sleeping pill on their bedside table, a chemical attempt to force the brain into submission. And some, sadly, will never wake up again. The entire world we have built is structured around our cycle of sleep and wakefulness. We live on a half-sleeping planet. Sleep is one of the most astonishing, unique, and poorly understood phenomena that touches every single one of us and our society as a whole. If sleep did not exist, our world would be an entirely different place. It would be a world without dreams, perhaps a world without the depth of imagination that defines our species. The Swiss sleep researcher Alexander Borbély once wrote that sleep, this utterly familiar and everyday process, nevertheless continues to elude our understanding. We fall asleep and wake up tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of times in our lives, and we take it for granted. We don't need to learn how to do it. Nature has bestowed this gift upon us. It just happens. The American philosopher Daniel Dennett coined a wonderful phrase for this sort of innate ability: competence without comprehension. We don't need to know what sleep is in order to fall asleep and wake up. We simply do it, without thinking about why or what this remarkable state that claims a third of our existence actually is. And curiously, the less we try to actively, consciously participate in the process of falling asleep, the easier it comes. It's a shy phenomenon. It retreats when observed. It's also strange that unlike so many other behaviors that we can perfect, with experience throughout our lives, our ability to sleep seems only to deteriorate. It is as if with age we unlearn how to do it. Our control over sleep, from the moment of onset to the process of returning to wakefulness, becomes less and less certain. To gain control over our own consciousness, to comprehend it, or even just to realize the possibility of comprehending it, this requires immense physical and mental effort, years of training. Is it any wonder that in Buddhist philosophy, awakening is considered the highest point of self-realization, something far beyond ordinary human capabilities? The very name of its founder, Buddha, means the awakened one in Sanskrit. His attainment of enlightenment marked the beginning of a new era in human civilization. Yet, it remains unclear what exactly the Buddha's awakening consisted of. As always, it comes down to definitions, to how we understand and relate to the concepts themselves. So, this process of returning from the other side, from the world of sleep to the reality of wakefulness, has inspired countless emotional descriptions, though they are all just timid attempts to put into words something that can only be felt and experienced personally. Try, for a moment, to explain what waking up is to an alien from a planet where no one sleeps, perhaps a being that evolved under a star that never sets. For us, it is the process that inextricably links our inner and outer worlds. It can only be understood if you consider it from both inside and out. At the moment of awakening, the world of nothingness or fantastical dreams materializes, transforming into the tangible forms of the external world. And that world in turn begins to act upon us again, and we regain our familiar ability to respond to it. This constant dynamic interaction between an organism and its environment is at the heart of a philosophical stance known as enactivism, the idea that cognitive functions can only be understood through the lens of this interaction. The brain, after all, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is part of a body, and a multitude of visible and invisible threads, from hormonal signals and shared blood flow to neural connections via the peripheral nervous system, bind it to our inner world. The process of sensing our internal state is called interoception, and sleep holds a crucial place in this relationship. It is one of the few states where the connections between brain, body, and environment are radically altered. Sleep is defined, above all, by the interaction between us and the world outside, not just by what happens in the depths of the brain, where billions of neurons residing in the eternal darkness of the skull toil away at deciphering and organizing the streams of information arriving through our senses. Charles Sherrington, in his seminal book Man on His Nature, offered a passage that poetically describes this moment of awakening. He imagined the brain's cortex, a moment before just a dark and silent landscape, suddenly lighting up with a flashing and scurrying of light points. The brain is waking, and with it the mind is returning. It is as if the Milky Way entered upon some cosmic dance. He compared it to an enchanted loom, where millions of flashing shuttles weave a dissolving pattern, always a meaningful pattern though never an abiding one, a shifting harmony of sub-patterns. It is a breathtaking image, isn't it? The universe inside the skull mirroring the universe outside. Today we know the brain is active during sleep, so the idea of sudden sparks of light is merely a metaphor. But how can we describe the process? And more importantly, why and how does it happen? How? Does the signal to wake up come from within, or is it a process that depends primarily on decisive external cues? The British poet and philosopher Frederick Myers described a phenomenon he called the hypnopompic state, that characteristic state of consciousness at the moment of awakening. The hallucinations that can occur during this time are thought to reflect the brain's attempt to explain and harmonize two streams of information, one originating from within, akin to imagination, and one from without, our sensory perception. It is the brain trying to resolve conflicts between these two realities. A similar kind of conflict manifests in the hypnic jerk, that characteristic sensation of falling as you're drifting off to sleep, which jolts you instantly awake. The origin of this phenomenon is unclear, but it may be related to different parts of the brain falling asleep at different rates. Perhaps the areas responsible for maintaining muscle tone momentarily lose their inhibitory signals from other brain structures, or they misinterpret the relaxation of the muscles as a dangerous loss of balance. In response, the brain instantly imagines a fall and generates the appropriate reaction to prevent it, to stop a fall that isn't happening. Time in that moment seems to run backwards. The fall hasn't occurred in reality, but the response to it, awakening, has already been formed. The hypnic jerk is a wonderful example of a sleep-related phenomenon, that we can speculate about endlessly without a definitive answer. But that is often how science progresses. As the neurobiologist Richard Axel said, imagination precedes knowledge. Another aspect of awakening is sleep inertia. The transition from sleep to wakefulness isn't instantaneous. It is a gradual process. Immediately after waking, we often feel unusual. This initial period is frequently characterized by a lowered level of attention, a certain disorientation in time and space. Where am I? What time is it? And a distinct subjective feeling of not being fully awake. This state has a clear, though not fully understood, neurophysiological basis. In laboratories, scientists have recorded characteristic changes in the brain's electrical activity, the EEG, in the first few minutes of wakefulness, as well as changes in the brain's responses to external stimulation and a noticeable dip in cognitive performance. You may have noticed, by the way, that a very short daytime nap can be far more refreshing than a longer one. One of the reasons for this is precisely sleep inertia. After the light, superficial stages of sleep, it doesn't manifest significantly. But if you allow sleep to progress into its deeper stages, the subsequent inertia can practically cancel out all the benefits. So what is happening in the brain? Recent studies in lab rodents have shown that the activity of neurons in the cortex is somewhat suppressed immediately after waking. The number of electrical discharges or nerve impulses through which neurons are thought to exchange information was about 15 to 20% lower in the first few minutes after spontaneously waking up compared to average levels during wakefulness. Moreover, the pattern of this activity was more reminiscent of the brain's activity during sleep. In other words, the mouse was awake, but not entirely. How, then, can we bring more clarity to this question? Is the mouse still asleep during awakening, or not? The physicist and astrobiologist Paul Davies, in his book The Demon in the Machine, mused about the possibility of developing a life sensor to determine if life exists on distant planets. It's a profound question. How do we define life? But he immediately conceded that the very question of what life is remains open. A life meter does not yet exist, he wrote. It is not even clear how one might work in principle. What would it measure? A mouse that has just died is scarcely less complex chemically than a mouse that is alive. Yet we do not say it is 99.9% alive. It is simply dead. Unfortunately, things aren't so simple with sleep. Based on some data, immediately after waking, a mouse can be in both states, wakefulness and sleep, simultaneously. And for that matter, so can we. We pause again. This brings us back to the quantum nature of reality. If a system can be in two states at once, then the universe is far richer and more complex than our binary logic allows. We are creatures of the dawn, neither fully of the night nor fully of the day, but existing in the twilight. What then is the biological purpose of sleep inertia? If a slow, gradual awakening has been preserved through natural selection, it must have conferred some survival advantage. At first glance, this seems surprising. Surely the ability to snap instantly from sleep to full alertness would be most adaptive and beneficial for survival. Imagine a predator approaching a sleeping animal. From the victim's perspective, even the slightest delay could be fatal. However, just as predators and their prey evolved separately, their relationship also co-evolved. One can imagine that a certain balance was eventually struck. The prey evolved to wake up quickly enough to have a good chance of escaping, but not so quickly that predators were left entirely without food and died out. It is an evolutionary arms race, played out over millions of years. Some laboratory studies point to a deeper sleep inertia after waking from REM sleep, the phase where the brain is more active, sometimes even more so than during normal wakefulness. Having observed a more pronounced suppression of neural firing upon exiting REM sleep, scientists have suggested that a slow, gradual awakening is preferable, given the neuroanatomical and neurochemical complexity of the brain's networks, especially in mammals with large brains. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of maintaining a balance of activity in the brain, an organ composed of an astronomical number of interconnected electrically active neurons. A single photon hitting the retina can be enough to trigger a visual sensation. Imagine what happens with the constant eruption of trillions of neurotransmitter molecules intersynaptic spaces every millisecond. That's why the inhibition of activity, or the reduction of the overall level of excitation, that accompanies global shifts between states of the brain and the entire organism can be especially important for preventing maladaptive hybrid behavioral states, like those that accompany hypnopompic hallucinations. It is better to wake up slowly and gradually, but surely. It prevents the system from crashing. This is particularly crucial at the moment when the direction of information flow being processed by the brain changes dramatically. During wakefulness, our attention is usually directed outwards. Our senses are tuned to perceive the external world. On both conscious and unconscious levels, we register external stimuli, which are immediately classified by their importance, and ideally an appropriate response is formed. Very little of what surrounds us is actually vital for our survival. So, what we need to do is filter out the unnecessary and focus on what is significant. Incidentally, one idea about the origin of cognitive impairments from sleep deprivation is that we lose the ability to distinguish the important from the insignificant, the useful from the useless, and the familiar and uninteresting from the new. As a result, we waste more of the brain's computational resources, including energy, on the pointless task of sorting through stimuli at the expense of solving more pressing problems. Either way, for our interaction with the world to be effective, there needs to be coordination between two main information streams that converge in the cortical and subcortical regions of the brain. Complex behavior requires careful observation of the environment, achieved through external senses like sight, hearing, and touch. A key component of this is attention, which, as we've said, includes the ability to distinguish important stimuli from irrelevant ones. However, our response is also controlled by internal sensory streams. First, there's the efferent copy, which allows us to distinguish sensory inputs generated by our own movement from external sensory information. Second, the brain constantly updates the position of the body and limbs using signals from proprioceptors in the muscles and tendons, as well as the vestibular system. Third, access to previously acquired memories plays a crucial role in executing motor programs and separating familiar stimuli from new ones. The continuous dynamic integration of these information sources is essential for generating efficient and economical behavioral responses, whether it is searching for food, exploring the environment, or escaping danger. During sleep, however, although the brain remains active, attention is not directed outwards, and the inflow of sensory information is minimal. Instead, patterns of brain activity corresponding to those that would normally accompany behavior are generated internally and remain, so to speak, unrealized. This is most vividly demonstrated in dreams, where the sleeping subject can not only move within an imagined internal space, but can sometimes perform actions that would be physically impossible in reality, such as flying. Obviously, the nature of brain activity in this state is quite different from that of wakefulness, but precisely which aspects are involved remains, alas, unclear. It was once thought that dreams occurred exclusively during REM sleep. We now know for certain that this isn't always the case. A method known as serial awakenings, where participants were woken up at regular intervals throughout the night, helped determine in which sleep stages dream reports are most likely. Each participant, immediately after being woken, had to answer the question, "Can you recall any mental activity just before you were woken up?" This specific phrasing is important, as people can have very different ideas about what constitutes a dream. In approximately 70% of cases, the answer was yes, regardless of the sleep stage. But even in cases where participants couldn't recall anything coherent, it is very difficult to prove that consciousness was completely absent. As the philosophers of mind Jennifer Wint, Tor Nielsen and Evan Thompson wrote, it is often said that consciousness vanishes in deep, dreamless sleep. We argue that this assumption is too simplistic. There are good empirical and theoretical reasons to think that a variety of conscious experiences can occur in all sleep stages, some of which are different from dreaming. A case in point is paradoxical insomnia. In this sleep disorder, patients go to a sleep lab, get wired up with electrodes and are told to sleep as they please. The next morning, some of them will sincerely claim they didn't sleep a wink, while the recorded polysomnogram unequivocally shows a full, healthy night's sleep that one could only envy. What is this, if not a manifestation of some kind of consciousness during sleep? Curiously, you can even find descriptions in medical literature of losing consciousness during sleep. The condition is called nocturnal syncope, and it is discovered upon waking with the distinct sensation of having just come out of a faint, complete with the characteristic ringing in the head and other signs of having just experienced a loss of consciousness while asleep. Of course, another explanation for the ability or inability to give a coherent dream report after waking might not be the presence or absence of consciousness, but simple forgetfulness. Indeed, in one study from 2017 describing serial awakenings, the authors noted that out of 240 cases with 32 participants, 5 had to be excluded due to technical problems, and 2 because the subjects were too drowsy after waking to answer questions coherently. It is easy to imagine that even when participants did answer questions about their dreams, their responses might have been quite limited. They simply couldn't remember if they had dreamt anything, or it felt as if they had. But what it was about, who knows? A familiar feeling, isn't it? This phenomenon has been called a white dream. Perhaps the inability to put the experience into words is because the brain regions responsible for speech are experiencing a localized sleep inertia, or are simply asleep, while the rest of the brain has almost returned to a waking state. Many experiments on both humans and lab animals show that the left and right hemispheres of the brain are engaged differently during REM and NREM sleep, which likely affects the ability to verbalize and give an oral report. This ability might be selectively suppressed during certain sleep phases, regardless of how much we are willing to tell the world. Just think how difficult it is to talk or understand speech when you are woken up in the middle of the night. So where does this nightly rhythm of waking and sleeping come from? Our ancestors didn't have the luxury of a smartphone alarm. For millennia, the call to wake was delivered by the natural world. The crowing of a rooster served as an excellent timekeeper. The first roosters would crow after midnight, signalling to the household that there were still hours of sleep to be had. The second roosters were the signal for the women of the house to rise and begin their work, so that by the time the third roosters crowed at dawn, breakfast would be ready. Church bells later took over this role in towns and cities, but with the Industrial Revolution came a new, relentless urban rhythm. Factories couldn't rely on roosters. In Russia, factory whistles roused workers right up until the 1950s. In Britain, a whole profession emerged, the knocker-up. These were people hired to go around in the early hours, tapping on workers' windows with long poles to make sure they got to the factories on time. For upper floors, they used even longer poles or even pea shooters. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the personal, mechanical alarm clock became commonplace, a device born out of the need to discipline human biology to the demands of the machine. The first patent for a mechanical adjustable alarm clock was granted to a Frenchman, Antoine Redier, in 1847. It was a simple device. You'd place a pin in a hole on the clock face corresponding to the hour you wanted to wake, and at the appointed time, a mechanism would strike a bell. It was a revolution, in its own small way. It marked the moment we began to fully outsource our awakening, handing over the responsibility from our internal biology to an external machine. We invented a device to jolt us out of a state we barely understood, a state governed by processes that were, and in many ways still are, a complete mystery. But what about spontaneous awakening? That feeling of waking up just moments before the alarm is due to go off? What internal process prepares the body for this transition? It starts with a simple assertion. Being awake is a source of stress, not necessarily negative stress, but physiological stress. When we are active, searching for food or avoiding danger, the body's energy resources are mobilized. The level of stress hormones like cortisol, which prepare us for the start of a new, potentially perilous day, begins to rise while we're still asleep, particularly in the final hour before we wake. This fact is particularly interesting. The German neuroscientist Jan Born conducted an experiment where participants were told they would be woken at a specific time, some early in the morning, others allowed to sleep as long as they liked. Of course, such experiments have strict protocols: no coffee, a regular sleep schedule beforehand, monitored by a wrist-worn actigraph. Then comes the night of the experiment in the lab. It is not easy to sleep in an unfamiliar environment. the famous first-night effect that sleep researchers know all too well. Eventually sleep comes, stage 1, then 2, then 3, then REM sleep, another cycle, and another, and then the gradual preparation for morning. The participants are in a completely isolated room, no light, no clocks, no cues about the time. The idea of morning is entirely relative, something each person can only gauge by some internal intuition or instinct. Instincts are the adaptations we are born with, the ones that don't require conscious thought, competence without comprehension, and what Bourne's experiment showed was astonishing. By measuring levels of a key stress hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, he found that while it gradually increases through the night for everyone, in those who were told they would be woken up, its level started to rise about a full hour earlier. It was as if the sleeping brain knew what was coming. It was anticipating the future. Even in sleep, a program is running, preparing us for wakefulness, partly independent of the time of day and even our own internal biological clocks. Who or what inside us is holding the stopwatch? The moment of awakening is like a shoreline where two worlds meet, the internal world of physiological processes striving for homeostasis, and the external world, with which we must maintain a precise temporal relationship to survive. Organisms, while autonomous, exist in a complex relationship with their environment. This has been true since the first single-cell life forms emerged, learning to harness energy from sunlight. The rotation of the Earth, with its periodic cycles of light, temperature, and radiation, was the crucial process that gave rise to biological rhythms. In those primordial times, before an atmosphere shielded the planet's surface, cosmic radiation was a matter of life and death. It is thought that the first organisms to survive were those that could adapt their metabolism to the light-dark cycle, shielding their most vulnerable biochemical reactions like DNA replication from the sun's harmful rays. The process of awakening in its most basic form was the preparation of these physiological processes for the onset of day, accounting for all the dangers that came with it. For hundreds of millions of years, this state of affairs likely persisted. Life was synchronized to the predictable changes of the planet. But this perfect adaptation also imposed severe limitations. At some pivotal moment, it turned out that being completely dependent on external factors wasn't the most efficient strategy. And that's when the revolution of sleep occurred. The stimulus for this revolution was the realization of the limitless possibilities that could open up if internal biochemical processes were regulated not only by external influences, but also by internal need. As Alexander Bailey wrote, the rigid control exerted by circadian rhythms could have negative consequences, programming periods of activity and rest to occur at a set time, rather than in accordance with the demands of a given situation. The emergence of sleep, he argued, might represent a partial liberation from these constraints, allowing restorative processes to occur according to the immediate needs of the animal. Imagine a single-celled organism whose membrane is damaged. If the biochemical processes for repair are most efficient only at certain times of day, its chances of survival are limited. Evolutionary pressure would favor the emergence of greater flexibility. The time came when life split into two states, sleep and wakefulness, as we now understand them. It was the dawning of a new era in the evolution of life on Earth, an escape from complete dependence on the whims of the environment. This brings us to one of the most difficult questions of all. We have this innate ability to sleep and wake, but what is it that prompts our spontaneous awakening? What is its purpose? Some believe our default state is wakefulness, and sleep is just what we do when all our other needs are met. But this can't be entirely right. The night is the same length for everyone, yet different species have adapted in wildly different ways. Some sleep for just a few hours, others for most of the day. The idea that our baseline state is actually sleep, and that we wake up only out of necessity to satisfy other basic needs, is gaining traction. It is as if the patterns of brain activity during sleep are more primitive, more fundamental, reminiscent of the spontaneous firing of an immature nervous system. It is as though every time we fall asleep we return to an embryonic state that is difficult to shake off completely as we mature. In a way, the same is true for the emergence of movement. The philosopher Maxine Sheets Johnstone posed the question, why is there movement? Alongside the great metaphysical question, why is there anything at all? Why did living things acquire this gift? The liberation from the environment, awakening, is directly linked to movement. An external stimulus can affect both living and non-living things equally, but only when that stimulus provokes an active response, a reaction to the action, does it begin to make sense to talk about a living organism. Movement is the quintessential expression of this response, but it is only truly meaningful when it's not merely a passive reaction, but something that anticipates, that prepares the organism for what might happen next. We wake up not just in response to a stimulus, but in order to engage with it. And so we must ask, what is the nature of this engagement? Is it merely mechanical, or is it the seed of consciousness itself? Is the ability to wake up the first step towards the ability to wonder? Experiments using transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, have shown something remarkable about the brain's reactivity. During wakefulness, the brain's response to an external magnetic pulse is incredibly complex, a rich and varied pattern of activity spreading across the cortex. During sleep, the response can be much stronger, more powerful, but it is also simpler, more stereotypical, an all-or-nothing affair. This method has been applied to patients with disorders of consciousness, such as those in a vegetative state. These patients can cycle between sleep and wakefulness, but they show no signs of awareness or purposeful response. However, by measuring the complexity of their brain's response to a TMS pulse, doctors can get a clue about the presence of underlying consciousness and the potential for recovery. The ability to generate a complex wake-like response, even in the absence of physical movement, is a powerful indicator. In other experiments, patients who were physically unable to move were asked to imagine performing tasks, like playing tennis or walking through their house. Functional brain scans revealed that in some cases the very same brain areas were activated as those in healthy volunteers performing the same imagined tasks. These examples confirm a fundamental link between consciousness, wakefulness, and the capacity for movement, whether real or imagined. The ability to awaken, to become a waking being, is inextricably tied to the ability to form an active response to the world. And what about the moon? For millennia, it was one of the most important components of our environment. It served as a source of time, a tool for navigation. The extra light at night allowed for work or hunting, but also warned of dangers from predators or rival tribes. The myths of werewolves and vampires tied to the full moon may have served as a kind of protection, keeping people indoors at night. It is not surprising, then, that even today the lunar cycle seems to affect our sleep. Recent studies, particularly those on pre-industrial societies like the Hadza in Tanzania or the Toba in Argentina, have shown that people tend to go to sleep later and sleep less in the nights leading up to the full moon, when the evening sky is brightest. This effect was even detectable, though smaller, in university students living in brightly lit cities who are largely unaware of the moon's phases. The researchers were surprised. It seems we're still tethered to these ancient rhythms in ways we don't fully appreciate. Some scientists even propose that we have two kinds of sleep: an obligatory, necessary sleep and an optional, pleasure sleep. After a relatively short sleep, we can feel perfectly restored. But if we stay in bed for a few extra hours, we don't always feel better. Sometimes we feel worse. What is the point of this excess sleep? One explanation is that it is a strategy. If conditions outside aren't favourable, it is safer to stay asleep, waiting for the signal that it is okay to emerge into the world. But let's go deeper, inside the mechanism of awakening itself. The longer we are awake, the more we need to sleep. The sleep debt accumulates. But does the reverse happen? Does a wakefulness debt build up while we sleep? It seems so. Think about hunger. The feeling is driven by changes in our blood, brain, and other organs, triggering the release of hormones that correct the metabolic imbalance. A specific area in the hypothalamus acts like a sensor, measuring glucose levels in the blood. Neurons that produce a hormone called orexin become active when glucose is low. These orexin neurons are one of the main centers for regulating wakefulness. When they are active, they send signals to other brain regions responsible for attention and movement. The whole system powers up, leading to a general awakening. We find and eat food, glucose levels rise, the orexin neurons quiet down, and sleepiness returns. It is a beautiful homeostatic loop, and something similar seems to happen with sleep itself. As we sleep, our energy reserves are depleted, orexin neurons might become active again, and the process of awakening begins. Plants do something similar. During the day, they store energy from sunlight as starch. At night, they consume it, precisely calculating the rate of consumption, so their reserves last exactly until sunrise. If you experimentally shorten their day, they'll burn through their starch more slowly to make it through the longer night. Then there are the more dramatic triggers for waking, like sleep apnea. When the airway becomes blocked, the pause between breaths can stretch to dangerous lengths. Areas in the brainstem and nerve endings in the body that are sensitive to carbon dioxide and oxygen levels send an emergency signal, which triggers an awakening, often via the hypothalamus. It is a life-saving mechanism. Or consider cluster headaches, which can occur with startling regularity, often waking people from sleep at the very same time each night. We don't know what causes them, but biological clocks almost certainly play a role. Just as cortisol levels rise in anticipation of waking, or glucose levels gradually fall, there are likely a multitude of other processes counting down the minutes of sleep, ready to signal the moment of awakening when it makes the most biological sense. Even the faintest stimulus can be enough. Many of our touch receptors only respond at the beginning and end of a touch. We can sleep wrapped in a blanket without feeling it, but wake at the slightest touch of a hand. We can fall asleep on a noisy train or plane, but be woken in a quiet bedroom by someone whispering our name. Does this mean we can perceive and even categorize stimuli while we are asleep? It seems so. Orexin neurons themselves have been shown to react to sounds even during sleep. Perhaps this is the brain making a decision, to wake or not to wake. In the wild, this ability is crucial. Ducks have been observed sleeping with one eye open, allowing them to scan their surroundings for predators. Pigeons exhibit a phenomenon known as collective vigilance. A pigeon sleeping alone is highly vigilant, but in a flock, individual vigilance decreases as the size of the group increases. The birds on the edge of the flock are more likely to sleep with one eye open, while those in the centre sleep more deeply. The collective alertness of the group, however, goes up. It is a shared responsibility. As the sleep researcher William Demant once paraphrased Shakespeare, someone must always watch so that others may sleep. The evolution of sleep has been a long and winding road, from the primal awakening of the first organisms to the complex homeostatic mechanisms that govern our lives today. Our expectations, our environment, and everything we do during the day shapes the sleep that follows. And so it goes, day after day, from the moment of our birth to the end of our lives. Our understanding of the world is built on the familiar idea that time moves irreversibly forward. The past is fixed. The future is unknown until it becomes the present. The physicist Carlo Rovelli once asked, "Why do we remember the past but not the future? It seems obvious, but is it?" The fact is, our biology is designed to meet the future. We don't just react to what's coming, we anticipate it. This ability is one of our most vital survival tools. We live in a predictable world. Day always follows night. Monday is always followed by Tuesday. January by February. This predictability is what allows our internal biological clocks, our circadian rhythms, to function. The word circadian comes from the Latin circa, meaning around, and dies, day. The whole point of these rhythms is to predict the cycle of day and night with remarkable accuracy, preparing our physiology and biochemistry for the states we will experience hours in advance. The first hint of this internal clock came in the 17th century, when the French astronomer Jean-Jacques de Méran noticed that the leaves of a mimosa plant, which followed the sun during the day, continued their movements even when the plant was placed in complete darkness. The plant somehow knew about the sun's rotation, even without sensing it directly. It was acting on an internal expectation. A more familiar example is jet lag. After a transatlantic flight, your internal clock is completely out of sync with the external world. your body is screaming for sleep when the sun is shining, or you find yourself wide awake in the middle of the night, it is a miserable feeling and a powerful demonstration of this internal rhythm. The journey to understanding this mechanism was long. For decades, the chronobiologist Jürgen Aschoff conducted his famous bunker experiments, where volunteers lived for weeks in underground apartments, completely isolated from any external time cues. They lived purely by their own internal clocks, and what these experiments revealed was that our internal day is rarely exactly 24 hours. It is usually a little longer. Every day we have to make a slight adjustment, synchronizing our internal clock to the 24-hour cycle of our planet. And the main signal for this adjustment is light. The mechanism itself is a marvel of molecular engineering, a masterpiece of negative feedback loops. It is a bit like a thermostat. When the temperature drops, the heating kicks in. When it reaches the set point, it switches off. In our cells, it isn't temperature but proteins. A pair of proteins, often called clock and BMAL1, act as activators. They switch on the production of another pair of proteins, Per and Cri. As the levels of Per and Cri build up, they travel back into the cell nucleus and do something remarkable. They switch off their own production by inhibiting clock and BMEL1. Then, over time, Per and Cri are degraded. As their levels fall, the inhibition is lifted, and clock and BMEL1 can start the cycle all over again. This intricate molecular dance takes roughly 24 hours to complete, and it happens in nearly every cell in our bodies. The discovery of these clock genes, first in fruit flies and later in mice and humans, earned Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael Young the Nobel Prize in 2017. It showed that the fundamental principle of timekeeping is shared across vast evolutionary distances. But how does the whole body stay in sync? There has to be a master conductor. This is the role of a tiny cluster of neurons in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. It sits just above the point where the optic nerves cross, and it receives direct input from the eyes. But, and this is crucial, it is not the same cells that we use for vision. There is a special set of light-sensitive cells in the retina that don't contribute to forming images. Their sole job is to tell the SCN whether it is light or dark outside. The SCN then acts as the master clock, sending out signals, hormonal and neural, that synchronize the countless smaller clocks in all the other cells of the body. It is a beautiful hierarchical system, but it is not infallible. If you try to force humans or animals onto a cycle that's too different from 24 hours, say a 22-hour day, the internal clock gives up. It decouples from the external light cycle and starts free-running on its own time. This has real-world implications. When NASA scientists were operating the Mars rovers, they had to live on a Martian day, which is about 37 minutes longer than an Earth day. It seems like a small difference, but after a few days, the team was suffering from severe chronic jet lag. It was another stark reminder of how deeply we're tied to the rhythms of our home planet. What is remarkable, then, is the way we take this nightly disappearance and reappearance for granted. Sleep, in a very real sense, is a behavior, but unlike most behaviors, it's one defined by an absence of movement, of response, of conscious awareness. This makes it incredibly difficult to pin down. The act of sleeping is, by its very nature, hidden from the person doing it. So we rely on external signs and on the technology that allows us to peer under the bonnet. And what that technology has shown us is that the sleeping brain is not a quiet, dormant organ. It is a place of immense structured activity. The old idea of sleep as simple rest has been completely overturned. Yet the question remains, what is all this activity for? It's a paradox that the more we learn about what the brain is doing during sleep, the more complex the question of why it's doing it becomes. We've moved from seeing sleep as a simple shutdown to seeing it as a series of highly specific, internally generated states. And this brings us to the discovery that truly revolutionized the field. The realization that sleep is not one single state, but at least two, fundamentally different from each other, and as different from each other as each is from wakefulness. This discovery was made, as many great discoveries are, partly by accident. In the early 1950s, a graduate student named Eugene Asarinsky was working in the lab of Nathaniel Kleitman, at the University of Chicago. He was tasked with observing sleeping infants, and he noticed periods where their eyes would dart back and forth beneath their closed eyelids. Kleitman was initially skeptical, but they soon confirmed the observation in adults as well. They had stumbled upon what we now call rapid eye movement, or REM sleep. When they woke people up during these periods, they found they were almost always in the middle of a vivid story-like dream. When they woke them from the other, quieter phases of sleep, non-REM or NREM sleep, dream reports were far less common and more thought-like. This was a watershed moment. It revealed that the night is not a uniform block of unconsciousness, but a structured journey through different neurological landscapes. The French neurophysiologist Michel Jouvet, studying cats, called REM sleep paradoxical sleep, because while the body was deeply relaxed, in fact almost completely paralyzed, the brain's electrical activity, the EEG, looked almost identical to that of an awake, alert cat. It was a waking brain in a sleeping body. The cycle between these two states is remarkably consistent. We typically descend through progressively deeper stages of NREM sleep, characterized by slowing brain waves of increasing amplitude, the so-called slow waves, or delta waves. This is the deepest, most restorative part of sleep, the state from which it is hardest to be roused. After about 90 minutes, the pattern reverses. We ascend back through the lighter stages, and instead of waking up, we enter our first period of REM sleep. This 90-minute cycle repeats throughout the night, 4 or 5 times, though the character of each cycle changes. The first half of the night is dominated by deep NREM sleep, while the second half sees longer and more intense periods of REM sleep. It is an intricate, beautifully choreographed ballet of neural activity. But what drives this cycle? One influential model, proposed by Alan Hobson and Robert McCarley, likens it to the population dynamics of predators and prey. They imagine 2 competing groups of neurons in the brainstem. One group, which they called REM-on cells, promotes REM sleep, while the other, REM-off cells, actively suppresses it. During NREM sleep and wakefulness, the REM-off cells are dominant, keeping the REM-on cells in check. But as they fire, they also gradually inhibit themselves, their activity wanes, and this releases the brake on the REM-on cells. The REM-on cells then burst into activity, triggering a period of REM sleep. But their firing in turn reactivates the REM-off cells, which then shut them down again, bringing the system back to NREM sleep. It is a beautiful, self-regulating oscillator, a push-pull dynamic that drives the nightly cycle. The discovery of orexin, the wakefulness-promoting hormone that is deficient in people with narcolepsy, added another layer of complexity, showing how this brainstem oscillator is itself regulated by higher-level systems in the hypothalamus, stabilizing the states of sleep and wakefulness. So why do we need this strange paradoxical state? Why have a waking brain in a paralyzed body? The initial link to dreaming was powerful. For a time, REM sleep and dreaming were seen as virtually synonymous. Experiments that selectively deprived people of REM sleep by waking them every time they entered the state seemed to lead to psychological disturbances, a kind of pressure to dream that built up over time. When finally allowed to sleep uninterrupted, they would experience a REM rebound, spending much more time in that state as if to make up for what they had lost. This suggested that REM sleep, or the dreaming it enabled, served a vital function. But then came a confounding observation. Patients taking certain types of classic antidepressants, particularly those that increase levels of monoamines like serotonin and noradrenaline, were found to have their REM sleep almost completely suppressed, sometimes for months or even years with no obvious ill effects. This was a major challenge to the idea that REM sleep was absolutely essential. It forced the field to reconsider. Perhaps the function of REM sleep could be accomplished in other ways, or perhaps its processes were being integrated into other states. It is another reminder that our neat categories might not be as clear-cut as we think. The discovery of REM sleep behavior disorder, a condition where the muscle paralysis of REM fails and people physically act out their dreams, further blurred the lines, showing what happens when the components of these states become dissociated. The sleeping brain is not an island. It is connected to and in constant dialogue with the body. And this brings us back to that fundamental question of what it is exactly that sleeps. Is it the whole organism, the brain, a specific brain circuit, or something even smaller? The idea of local sleep suggests that sleep might not be a global phenomenon at all. We've seen it in dolphins, sleeping one hemisphere at a time, but there is growing evidence that it happens in us too. After a long period of sleep deprivation, you can be technically awake, but recordings from your brain will show pockets of neurons firing in a sleep-like pattern. These are the moments when your attention lapses, when you make a mistake. It is as if small parts of your cortex are taking tiny, unauthorized naps. The longer you stay awake, the more these local sleep events intrude into your wakefulness. This idea completely reframes our understanding of sleep pressure. Perhaps the feeling of sleepiness isn't a signal from a central sleep center, but the cumulative effect of millions of individual neurons and small circuits reaching their operational limits and beginning to switch off. The homeostatic drive for sleep, the longer you are awake, the more you need to sleep, might be a fundamentally local process that becomes a global phenomenon. Think of it like a stadium full of people. At first, everyone is alert and watching the game, but as time goes on, individuals start to get tired. One person dozes off, then another. At first, it isn't noticeable. But as more and more people fall asleep, the overall atmosphere of the stadium changes. The roar of the crowd becomes a murmur. Eventually a tipping point is reached, and the entire stadium falls quiet. The global state of sleep emerges from the local states of its individual components. This local view has profound implications for the function of sleep. One of the leading theories, the synaptic homeostasis hypothesis proposed by Giulio Tononi and Chiara Cirelli, suggests that wakefulness is fundamentally a process of learning, of strengthening the connections, the synapses, between our neurons. Throughout the day, as we interact with the world, our synapses get stronger and more numerous. This is great for learning, but it is also energetically expensive and unsustainable. The brain would become saturated, noisy, and unable to learn anything new. Sleep, according to this theory, is the price we pay for plasticity. It is a period of systematic, intelligent pruning. While we sleep, our brain scales down the vast majority of our synapses, particularly the weaker ones formed during the day. This saves energy, improves the signal-to-noise ratio in our neural circuits, and crucially, makes room for new learning the next day. It is not about erasing memories, but about consolidating them by getting rid of the background noise, keeping the strong signals and integrating them into our existing knowledge. The slow waves of deep sleep are thought to be the key mechanism for this process, a rhythmic tide that washes over the cortex, weakening synapses as it goes. If a particular part of the brain has been working especially hard during the day, say, the motor cortex after learning a new piano piece, the slow waves in that specific region will be even stronger and deeper that night, as if providing targeted restoration where it is needed most. It is a beautiful and elegant theory, and it helps explain so much from the local nature of sleep pressure to the cognitive deficits of sleep deprivation. But it is almost certainly not the whole story. Another crucial function of sleep seems to be simple housekeeping. In 2012, a team led by Mike and Nedergaard discovered a remarkable system they called the glymphatic system. It is a network of channels that piggybacks on the brain's blood vessels and allows cerebrospinal fluid to flow through the brain tissue, washing away metabolic waste products that accumulate during the day, things like amyloid beta, the protein that forms the infamous plaques in Alzheimer's disease. And what they found was that this system is almost 10 times more active during sleep than during wakefulness. During sleep, the brain cells themselves seem to shrink slightly, opening up the space between them to allow the fluid to flow more freely. It is as if the city of the brain, bustling with activity during the day, shuts down its main operations at night to allow the cleaning crews to come through and clear away the rubbish. If you don't get enough sleep, that waste builds up, and over a lifetime that could have devastating consequences. So we have at least two powerful, compelling reasons why we might sleep: for synaptic renormalization and for waste clearance. And there are others: energy conservation, immune system regulation, emotional processing. It is entirely possible, and even likely, that sleep doesn't have one single function, but is a multi-purpose, indispensable process that serves many masters. It might be that this state of disconnectedness, this period of being offline, is simply the only time the brain can perform these essential maintenance tasks without the constant interruption of interacting with the outside world. And this brings us back to the grandest scale of all, the ecology of sleep. Why the vast diversity? Why do sloths in captivity sleep nearly twice as long as their counterparts in the wild? Why do giraffes and elephants get by on so little? The traditional brain-centric view struggles to explain this. But if we think of sleep not just as a process for the individual, but as a strategy within an ecosystem, a new perspective emerges. The neurobiologist Jerome Siegel has championed this idea, arguing that sleep's primary ancestral function is not restorative, but adaptive. It is a form of adaptive inactivity. Sleep enforces a period of stillness and quiet when being active would be inefficient or dangerous. For a diurnal creature like us, with poor night vision, foraging in the dark is a risky and low-yield proposition. It makes more evolutionary sense to find a safe place, shut down, conserve energy, and wait for the sun to rise. For a nocturnal predator, the opposite is true. Sleep keeps them out of the way during the bright, exposed hours of the day. From this perspective, sleep is a tool for carving up the 24-hour day into different temporal niches, reducing competition and predation risk. The restorative functions, the synaptic pruning, the waste clearance, might be incredibly important processes that evolved to take advantage of this enforced downtime, but the primary driver was ecological. Sleep isn't an error of evolution. It is a brilliant solution to the problem of how to survive on a spinning, dangerous planet. It is the ultimate energy-saving mode, a way of disappearing from the world for a little while, so that you can return to it, refreshed and ready when your time comes again. The chemistry of our lives and our sleep is a story of interaction. It is about how the outside gets in and how our internal world responds. Think of oxygen. For the first billion or so years of life on Earth, it was a poison. But the evolution of photosynthesis changed everything, flooding the atmosphere with this highly reactive gas. Life had to adapt or die, and this adaptation is written into our deepest chemistry. The molecular clocks in our cells are intimately linked to the mechanisms that sense and respond to oxygen levels. The Nobel Prize-winning discovery of HIF-1 alpha, a protein that acts as a master switch for the body's response to low oxygen, revealed just how deeply these systems are intertwined. Your body's response to a lack of oxygen, hypoxia, is different at different times of day, and remarkably, inducing a state of mild hypoxia can actually help you adapt more quickly to jet lag. It is as if by tricking the body into thinking it is at high altitude, you can accelerate the resetting of its internal clocks. And then there is caffeine, the world's most popular psychoactive drug. It works by impersonating a molecule called adenosine. Adenosine is a byproduct of energy consumption in our cells. As we go through the day, thinking and acting, adenosine levels gradually build up in the brain. It acts as a signal of metabolic fatigue, binding to specific receptors on neurons and making them less likely to fire. It is the molecular basis of sleep pressure. The more adenosine you have, the sleepier you feel. Caffeine has a molecular shape that's incredibly similar to adenosine. It fits perfectly into the same receptors, but it doesn't activate them. It just sits there, blocking them. It is like putting a key in a lock that fits but won't turn. The adenosine can't get in to deliver its time to sleep message, so the neurons keep firing as if they are still fresh. The brain is tricked into feeling alert. But of course, the adenosine is still building up in the background, which is why, when the caffeine eventually wears off, the wave of sleepiness that hits can be so overwhelming. It is the accumulated debt coming due all at once. And what about the other side of the coin? The chemicals that promote sleep. For decades, the dominant sleeping pills were benzodiazepines, like Valium, and before them, barbiturates. These drugs work by enhancing the effect of the brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA. They bind to GABA receptors and make them even more effective at shutting down neural activity. They induce a state that looks, on the surface, like sleep. But it is not the same. They suppress deep, slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, altering the fundamental architecture of the night. It is more of a chemical anesthesia than a natural biological sleep. And this reveals a profound truth. You can force the brain into unconsciousness, but you can't necessarily force it to perform the complex restorative functions that make sleep so vital. Perhaps the most fascinating chemical story is that of psychedelics, substances like psilocybin from magic mushrooms or LSD. These molecules act primarily on the serotonin system, and they produce a state of consciousness that is radically different from normal waking life. It is often compared to dreaming while awake, and there is growing evidence that these substances might be powerful therapeutic tools, particularly for depression. A single dose of psilocybin can produce a dramatic and lasting antidepressant effect in some people, something that can take months to achieve with conventional drugs, if at all. How? One theory is that they induce a kind of reset of the brain's networks. In depression, the brain can get stuck in rigid, looping patterns of negative thought, particularly in a network called the default mode network. Psychedelics seem to dramatically disrupt this network, allowing new, more flexible connections to form. It is like shaking up a snow globe, allowing the flakes to settle in a new, healthier pattern. And intriguingly, this process of profound neural reorganization is exactly what some theories propose happens during sleep. It is possible that psychedelics are, in a way, hijacking the brain's natural mechanisms for plasticity and renewal, the very mechanisms that sleep evolved to facilitate. The fact that plants and fungi produce these powerful molecules that fit so perfectly into the receptors of our own brains is not a coincidence. It is the signature of a long-shared evolutionary history. We haven't evolved in isolation. We have co-evolved in a rich chemical soup, in a constant dialogue with the other life forms on this planet. They produce chemicals to defend themselves or to attract pollinators, and we in turn have evolved the machinery to sense and respond to those chemicals. Sometimes that response is a warning, don't eat this. Other times it is an invitation. Our brains are a part of this planet's ecosystem, not separate from it. And so, our consciousness, our behavior, and our sleep are all shaped by this deep, ancient, chemical conversation. We are, in the end, a part of the Earth's chemistry, dreaming itself into awareness, and every night we return to that fundamental chemical state, surrendering our complex minds to the simple, profound rhythms of the planet.